or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dasha, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the Friday, April 10th issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Looking at U.S. news, the war's toll on the economy is set to linger. The fragile 2-week ceasefire involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran is welcome news for the U.S. economy, but don't expect an immediate return to normal. This is by Conrad Poutier, David Uberti, and Patrick Thomas. In recent weeks, soaring gasoline prices and climbing mortgage rates pinched consumers already unhappy about the high cost of living. Rising energy and transportation costs squeezed businesses. As the war hit stocks, household wealth fell, threatening to dent consumer spending. Some economists even started worrying about a recession. Stocks have rebounded since news of the ceasefire. Still, economists caution that the war's economic fallout won't be undone overnight. The Strait of Hormuz would need to be open and back to normal for a month or two for things to go back to normal, said Dan North, senior economist at Allianz Trade North America. It's like cars backed up at a toll booth, he said. It will take a while to repair damaged infrastructure in Persian Gulf countries, and it is also unclear whether the ceasefire agreement will hold. Gas prices shoot up quickly, but come down slowly. U.S. crude futures saw one of the steepest drops on record Wednesday, 16%, but analysts warned that the price plunge would have to hold for a week or longer to push gasoline prices below $4 a gallon. And on Thursday, the price bounced back by nearly 3.7% to $97.87 a barrel. The national average for regular gasoline reached $4.17 a gallon on Thursday, the highest point of the war, and up about $1.19 since it began, AAA said. Nationwide diesel prices also notched a wartime high of $5.69 a gallon. The U.S. is a major oil producer, but its products still sell on the global market. That means the U.S. is affected by disruptions in the Mideast. Many oil fields and production facilities across the Persian Gulf are still halted, while missiles and drones fly. Tanker operators remain wary of venturing into the region, and a globe-spanning supply chain for fuel often requires weeks before changes in financial markets translate to sustained price drops at gas stations. All eyes are now on Friday's inflation report. Economists polled by the Wall Street Journal estimate that the annual inflation surged to 3.3% last month. If the forecast is accurate, it would mean a sharp jump from 2.4% in February, driven by energy costs. They expect month-over-month inflation to have tripled from February to 0.9%. The ceasefire could slow the rate of inflation in April and May, but it won't erase the risk that war-related inflation will continue. Higher fuel costs will continue to apply pressure on inflation until they ease. The war has also pushed up the price of many goods made from petrochemicals, such as plastics and fertilizer. Companies are often far quicker to raise prices than to lower them, especially while the risk of renewed fighting remains. Prices are sticky, said Allianz North. They're sticky one way. The Federal Reserve isn't likely to rush to lower interest rates. The ceasefire might even make it more likely that rates remain stuck. That is because a steady ceasefire removes the risk of supply chain disruptions that hurt the economy, but doesn't remove the risk of inflation pressures. Energy and goods prices that rose during the conflict won't be fully reversed. Financial conditions are easing, and the labor market has held up well enough that the Fed doesn't feel pressure to ride to the rescue. Erasing the risk of severe demand destruction leaves an inflation problem that wasn't fully extinguished before the war. Plus, elevated energy prices are likely to remain a problem. A decline in mortgage rates would come as a relief to homebuyers who were whiplashed when rates started rising quickly after the war in Iran began. The average rate for a 30-year fixed mortgage fell to 6.37% this week from 6.46% last week, which was a high since September, according to Freddie Mac. The 10-year Treasury yield has fallen since early Tuesday, a signal that mortgage rates could also head lower. The 30-year mortgage rate tends to loosely track the 10-year yield. A quick decline in rates, if the current ceasefire continues, would be good news to home builders, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders. But would-be buyers remain nervous about the job market and reluctant to pay high home prices. So it could take more than a small drop in rates to bring them off the sidelines. Fighting in the Mideast has choked off a big chunk of the world's fertilizer supply and sent prices for certain fertilizers up 40% from where they were in late February. The Strait of Hormuz is a key conduit for exports of fertilizer and natural gas, a critical ingredient for making crop nutrients. Higher fertilizer prices are prompting some farmers to change their planting plans, switching some acres from corn to less fertilizer-intensive soybeans. But most farmers had secured the bulk of their fertilizer supplies for this spring. High prices for fertilizer and the diesel fuel that farmers need for their tractors, combines, and other equipment aren't expected to come down right away. These increases will still strain U.S. farmers' balance sheets at a time when low crop prices and rising costs for things like equipment and seeds are denting profits. Also in U.S. news, U.S. fertility rates fall, reaching record lows, by Anthony DeBarros, Paul Overberg, and Andrea Peterson. The nation's fertility rates hit record lows in 2025 as childbearing continued to shift toward older women, federal data released Thursday showed. For the sixth straight year, the number of children born in the U.S. remained at about 3.6 million. The number of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 44, the general fertility rate, reached a record low of 53.1 in 2025, the provisional data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention show. The rate has mostly headed down since 2007, a pre-recession peak when millennial women started to enter their prime childbearing years. One long-term trend driving the slide, a sharp decrease in birth rates for teens and women in their 20s. In 2025, birth rates for women in their late 30s exceeded those for women in their early 20s for the first time. The lack of growth in births continues to be driven by uncertainty about the future, including concern over finances, relationship stability, and the political climate, said Wendy Manning, a demographer at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. However, research shows many women still desire to have children. People are waiting longer to enter parenthood and probably want to make sure that things are set in their lives before they do so, said Manning, co-director of the university's National Center for Family and Marriage Research. There might be a lot of uncertainty, and that might not be good for society in general. The teen birth rate fell 7% last year, extending a years-long decline related to public health campaigns and growing use of longer-acting contraceptives. Since 2007, the birth rate for 15 to 19-year-olds has fallen 72% in the U.S. We spent decades and lots of money trying to discourage early childbearing, saying, this will ruin your life. Don't ruin your kid's life. Don't do it, said Karen Benjamin Goodso, director of the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In the 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. had much higher teen birth rates than many other developed countries, she said. Among adolescents aged 15 to 17, the birth rate dropped 11% in 2025. Among those ages 18 and 19, the rate fell 7%, according to CDC data. Another measure, the total fertility rate, also hit a record low. The total fertility rate is the average number of children each woman would have in her lifetime, if birth rates for each age group were to continue at that year's pace through her childbearing years. A rate below 2.1 means a population isn't replacing itself and will eventually shrink without immigration. Last year, the U.S.'s total fertility rate fell to 1.57 births per woman, A Wall Street Journal calculation using provisional CDC data found. The drop in total fertility in the U.S. follows worldwide trends, but it remains higher than in many developed nations. The most recent estimates from the United Nations show that the worldwide rate continued to fall in 2023 and was nearing replacement level. It had dropped below replacement level in more than half of all countries. Flat births and a rising number of deaths are eroding a perennial source of population growth. Last year, the U.S. recorded just over 500,000 more births than deaths. Census Bureau and Congressional Budget Office projections show that this small surplus of births over deaths will end in the next decade. Should that happen, growth would depend on immigration. While non-Hispanic white women saw a small increase in births last year, births by women of other groups declined slightly. Provisional birth data for 2025 reflects more than 99% of birth records analyzed by the federal government. The totals and rates are typically adjusted when the final data is released. Also from U.S. News by Liz Esley White, the application for a drug to treat autism has been pulled. GSK withdrew its application for a drug touted last year by President Trump as a potential treatment for autism symptoms, just months after the company submitted it at the request of health officials. The UK drug maker asked the Food and Drug Administration to pull its application for the drug leucovorin calcium because it doesn't market the medicine according to a regulatory filing posted Thursday. The FDA had just approved leucovorin last month. Generic forms of the medicine will still be available. Leucovorin rose to prominence after Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. called it an exciting therapy that may benefit large numbers of children who suffer from autism at a viral White House press conference in September. His comments were part of a wider push by the administration to look for causes and more effective treatments for autism symptoms, which affect 1 out of every 31 children in the U.S. Kennedy has previously said vaccines may cause autism, despite no proven association. GSK hadn't sold the drug since 1999. At the request of the Food and Drug Administration, GSK said in September it would submit its application for patients with cerebral folate transport deficiency, a rare genetic condition with similarities to autism, in a move that allowed the agency to update the label for the drug and its generic counterparts. FDA officials last month announced they had approved the drug for that condition based on a review of existing studies, but said in a call with reporters that they hadn't found enough evidence to merit endorsing the drug's use to treat autism more broadly. Senior FDA officials said they examined scientific studies to see if they could approve leucovorin to treat autism, but didn't come up with enough strong scientific evidence to do so. A spokesman for the Department of Health and Human Services said GSK's withdrawal on Thursday doesn't affect generic versions of the drug, which already have updated labels for the genetic condition. GSK's action does not affect the availability of generic leucovorin, for patients with cerebral folate deficiency, or the labeling of leucovorin products, an HHS spokesman said. A GSK spokeswoman said the company had never intended to sell the drug again. Generic formulations of leucovorin are approved and are now able to add to the treatment of cerebral folate transport deficiency in adult and pediatric patients with a specific generic variant, a GSK spokeswoman said, adding that the withdrawal was procedural. Autism researchers have said leucovorin is worth studying, but there isn't yet convincing proof that it helps ease autism symptoms. Several small studies have found that it helps alleviate verbal symptoms in some autistic children, and the pronunciation on that drug apparently should be leucovorin. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal. on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Looking at the opinion section, New England considers the nuclear option. This is by Andrew Fowler, a communications specialist at the Yankee Institute based in Hartford, Connecticut. A bipartisan coalition of all 6 New England governors has reached a conclusion that until recently would have been politically unthinkable. Renewable energy alone can't deliver the affordable, reliable power the region needs. In a March 31st joint statement, the governors called for a diverse energy strategy, identifying nuclear power as essential to meet growing demand and safeguard the region's collective energy future. The shift reflects a broader trend. Energy policy is no longer only about emissions targets, it's increasingly about cost and reliability. Electricity prices in the region today are among the highest in the country. Natural gas last year accounted for 55% of generation in the region, and nuclear for 25%. New England has invested heavily in renewable energy, particularly offshore wind and solar. Renewables last year accounted for 13% of total generation. By nature, they're intermittent and risk prolonged blackout. Against this backdrop, nuclear energy is re-emerging as a practical solution. Nuclear power is consistent and is already a major source of clean energy in the U.S., providing hundreds of millions of metric tons of preventing emissions annually. In New England, nuclear facilities such as Connecticut's Millstone Power Station help maintain grid stability, powering roughly 2 million homes. Yet regulatory barriers have long limited the development of new nuclear capacity. That is beginning to change. Public opinion is shifting, and policymakers increasingly recognize that meeting climate goals without reliable baseload power is unrealistic. A 2026 analysis from regional think tanks, including my own, estimates that meeting the region's energy needs with nuclear power would cost roughly $415 billion, about half the cost of a renewable heavy system, while reducing emissions by 92% by 2050. Other countries offer practical lessons. France generates about 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, maintaining low emissions while exporting energy to neighboring nations. By contrast, European nations that rely heavily on intermittent renewables have faced higher costs and reliability challenges. The conclusion isn't that we should abandon renewables, it's that they can't stand alone. Energy policy requires balance. Wind and solar can help reduce emissions, but without complementary investments in sources like nuclear, the region risks higher costs and greater instability. As electricity demand rises, driven by data centers and advanced manufacturing, regions that can deliver reliable, affordable power will also have a competitive advantage. New England will fall behind if it can't meet demand. If affordability is a priority, policymakers must focus on scaling up energy sources that work. Nuclear energy represents an area of alignment across political lines. Policymakers can reduce barriers to nuclear development, encourage investment, and build an energy system that's cleaner, more reliable, and affordable. A region's energy policy will be judged by whether the lights stay on and whether people can afford the bill. In Review and Outlook, the truth about Medicare Advantage. The Trump administration is considering automatically enrolling Medicare beneficiaries in private insurance plans, aka Medicare Advantage, as a default. This may be the single most effective way to reduce Medicare waste, fraud, and abuse. So why do Democrats oppose it? Democrats are trying to flip the script by claiming that Medicare Advantage is wasting money. Insurers, Democratic senators wrote last week to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, are endangering the solvency of the Medicare trust funds. This misinformation deserves a rebuttal. Congress created Medicare Advantage in 1997 with the goal of using market competition to improve care for seniors and restrain spending. CMS makes payments to insurers based on what it estimates the traditional fee-for-service would spend to cover the same seniors. Payments are adjusted for medical risk factors, so insurers are paid more to cover sicker beneficiaries. This is intended to prevent plans that discourage seniors with costly medical conditions from enrolling. Insurers use savings from reducing waste to lower patient costs and offer supplemental benefits like dental and vision care. Democrats claim insurers are reaping outsized profits, but their margins are capped by law. Insurers increase profits by offering better benefits and lower costs and expanding market share. Most Advantage enrollees pay no premium besides their Part B outpatient requirement, compared to about $3,000 for traditional Medicare with supplemental gap policies. Unlike traditional Medicare, Advantage plans also have out-of-pocket spending caps. All of this has made the plans popular, and more than half of beneficiaries are covered by Advantage. Democrats also claim plans are overpaid by some $1.2 trillion over 10 years. How can that be when Advantage's share of spending is commensurate with its share of beneficiaries? Democrats claim the private plans draw healthier enrollees than traditional Medicare, so they should be paid less than they are. Yet Advantage enrollees are less likely to report themselves as in excellent or very good health than those in fee-for-service. They are also much more likely to be low income, which Democrats say is a social determinant of health. Advantage plans cover a larger share of Medicare, Medicaid dual eligibles who have very low incomes or are disabled. Democrats and their academic allies simply presume that Advantage enrolls healthier seniors because the plans are able to provide more benefits at less cost than traditional Medicare. Well, that's because insurers do a better job of managing costs. Consider skin substitutes that treat severe burns or wounds. A Health and Human Services Department Inspector General report last fall found that fee-for-service spending on these treatments rose 640% between the third quarters of 2022 and 2024. Providers applied skin substitutes to minor scrapes and bruises at an average cost of $121,501 per patient and $230,103 for those treated at home. Advantage plans combined spent 93% less on substitutes than traditional Medicare, which the IG attributed to insurers using reimbursement and utilization management tools to limit abuse. CMS has also flagged fraud in traditional Medicare hospice care and purchases of medical equipment like catheters. The agency this year launched a pilot program to require prior authorization in traditional Medicare for treatments that are especially vulnerable to fraud. Democrats oppose it. They also want Advantage plans to stop prior authorization, which they falsely claim delays care. Only 7% of Advantage medical claims require prior authorization, and 98% of them are approved. Advantage insurers say they approve requests within a day on average, and in only 6 hours for the most urgent. Democrats also accuse insurers of upcoding beneficiaries to collect bigger Medicare payments. This no doubt happens, but the far bigger problem is overbilling by providers. A 2024 study in the journal Health Affairs found that hospital discharges with the highest Medicare severity billing coding rose 41% between 2011 and 2019. The payment system creates incentives for hospitals to upcode patients to a higher level of complexity, the study said. Advantage plans reduce those incentives. A new peer-reviewed paper by researchers affiliated with Advantage insurer Elevance Health finds that a 10 percentage point increase in Advantage enrollment in a county is associated with $146 to $194 less in Medicare spending per capita. Insurers are a bipartisan scapegoat for rising Medicare spending. But it's notable that overall Medicare spending last decade totaled $431 billion less than the Congressional Budget Office projected in 2010, even as the share of beneficiaries in Advantage increased by half. Democrats dislike Advantage because they prefer government-run health care, though the latter has higher costs. The opposition to Advantage is ideological, no matter the facts. Also in Review and Outlook, Medicaid rises 10%, defense 4%. President Trump's new budget proposal shrinks from serious entitlement reforms, which is no surprise. Maybe the White House worries Democrats would use the issue to attack Republicans in the midterms, but the Congressional Budget Office's budget review for March is another reminder that a sustained defense buildup will require changes that slow the growth in entitlements. The deficit during the first 6 months of this fiscal year totaled $1.2 trillion, which is $139 billion less than the same period last year. Credit for the smaller deficit goes to taxpayers and ebullient financial markets. Receipts have increased by $223 billion, mainly from a $101 billion, or 9% increase, in individual income taxes, $42 billion more in payroll taxes, and a 283% increase, or $123 billion more, in customs duties, i.e. tariffs. In other words, taxpayers continue to pay their fair share of income to fund the government. Non-withheld tax payments have grown by $80 billion, 28%, compared to last year, as soaring stock prices lifted capital gains. The AI boom and the administration's deregulation may be offsetting economic damage from Mr. Trump's tariffs, at least for now. Although the Supreme Court struck down Mr. Trump's emergency tariffs in February, CBO says customs duties last month were nearly 3 times the amount last March, a period in which his emergency tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China were in effect. In other words, even though businesses no longer have to pay the emergency tariffs, they are still getting whacked by sundry other border taxes, including his national security tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, and more. The fiscal problem is, as always, the other side of the ledger, as outlays increased by $84 billion during the first 6 months of this year to $3.6 trillion. Spending on most non-defense discretionary programs fell, but these declines were more than offset by higher outlays on Social Security, a $42 billion increase, Medicare, $34 billion, Medicaid, $33 billion, and net interest payments, $33 billion. Defense rose by $18 billion, or 4%. Mr. Trump's budget proposes cuts to non-defense discretionary spending, but these will be swamped over time by ballooning entitlement spending. Medicaid spending has increased 10% compared to last year, despite the GOP tax bill's modest reforms. Republicans ought to use a second budget reconciliation bill to pass more significant Medicaid reforms like block grants. Democrats and their friends in the press will falsely accuse Republicans of gutting Medicaid, no matter what they do. They might as well go big. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. On the opinion page, by Ruel Mark Garrick and Ray Takei. Mr. Garrick is a resident scholar at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. Mr. Takei is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. How Trump miscalculated in Iran. Donald Trump threatened to end Iranian civilization, then sued for peace. If the 2-week ceasefire is extended, which seems likely, the extra time won't resolve the conflict's underlying causes. The Islamic Republic is at war with its own history, to borrow from the former hostage and diplomat John Limbert. So much that is Persian, as well as the Western ideas that have poured into Iran for more than a century, eats away at the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. Mr. Trump's threats aside, he doesn't see where this regime gains strength among those Iranian men who still believe in the revolution. Amid the corruption, cynicism, and breakdown of governance they have caused, these believers still seek a defining struggle of good versus evil. The hardened men who rule Iran see this war in existential terms. Their planning appears more judicious than the U.S. initially assumed. They husband munitions for less intense but persistent barrages. The Islamic Republic's leaders have thus prolonged the war and rattled the global economy. Western anxiety over this conflict and the start of negotiations between Tehran and Washington make it less likely that America, and by extension Israel, might come to the aid of another Iranian insurrection. Survival has always been the clerical regime's primary objective. Its rulers truly believe that the country's vast internal dissent is in part fueled by foreign conspiracies. If they inflict enough pain on the U.S. and encourage it to disengage from the Middle East, that makes it less likely that the millions of Iranians who loathe the regime will rally successfully against it. Compromising on anything fundamental through diplomacy with Washington threatens the regime at home. Too much of the Islamic Republic's aura has already been compromised. Too many iconic leaders have been killed. Too much of Iran's defense degraded. Since the pro-democracy Green Movement in 2009, the regime has understood that more nationwide protests are always on the horizon. This perpetual instability likely led many Israelis, perhaps first and foremost Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to believe that the regime was more brittle than it actually was. Hit it hard enough in the right spots, eliminate the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and many of his minions, and the Nizam, the system, might unravel. After last June's 12-day war, the regime desperately needed some narrative of success. It can now claim with some justification that it stood up to America and Israel and beat the great Satan in the Strait of Hormuz. The Persian Gulf, there's a reason why serious people have never called it the Arabian Gulf, has become Tehran's indispensable hostage. Abbas Araghchi, the smug Iranian foreign minister, captured well the leverage when he announced the ceasefire, noting, quote, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz will be possible by a coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration for technical limitations, end quote. From the beginning, the Israelis best understood the limits of power in the Middle East. They know that conclusive victories are unlikely. Lawns once mowed have to be trimmed. The Islamic Republic would need to be bombed even when there's no nuclear urgency or a provocation. As long as Tehran had Russian and Chinese support, Jerusalem would need periodically to degrade Iran's missile force and air defense networks. After the horror of October 7, 2023, Mr. Netanyahu aspired for more than mowing. So too, it appears, did Mr. Trump, at least for a few weeks. America was the most consequential and the least steady actor in this conflict. Mr. Trump assumed that the Venezuela model could apply in Iran, that the successors to the martyred supreme leader would be willing to make peace on the American president's term. The cynicism that one often sees in, quote, realist, unquote, analysis of the Islamic Republic, that the regime religiously had run out of gas and now survives on corruption and brute force, may well have made it into Mr. Trump's circle. He confused a Latin American kleptocracy for an ideological regime ruled by men who sincerely claim to know God's will. The president surely now knows what Barack Obama seems to have learned after his presidency, that the Islamic Republic doesn't evolve. Mr. Trump was the first president to bomb Iran, and maybe the last. Given his fixation with the stock market, he may now turn his attention elsewhere. Containing determined adversaries requires building a domestic consensus and cajoling allies. Reclaiming the Gulf from Iran would need the concentration of considerable naval assets for a long time, likely months, even years. For a politician who lives in the moment and sees most U.S. allies as parasites, this seems too much to ask. On the home front, the Democratic Party is solidly against Mr. Trump's war. The commentariat persists in its claim that this was a war that couldn't have been won and shouldn't have been fought. The Republican Party harbors its own powerful isolationist voices, and the American people never warmed up to a conflict whose objectives weren't clearly defined. Mowing the lawn just doesn't fit the American psyche. To many Americans, it seems immoral. If the U.S. steps aside, it is hard to see Israel going it alone. The Iranians have learned that they possess leverage through the Gulf. To mow the Iranian lawn again, Jerusalem will need diplomatic cover, arms, and logistical support from its superpower benefactor. All Israeli prime ministers, including Mr. Netanyahu, sought an American green light before proceeding against Tehran. When Washington refused, Jerusalem stood down. Nuclear arms have never been more essential for the Islamic Revolution. Ali Khamenei proved hesitant and didn't cross the threshold when everything changed after the October 7th attacks. Twice bombed in 8 months, his successors won't make that mistake if they can keep control of the country. Paradoxically, a war to disarm the Islamic Republic may pave the way for its ultimate rearmament. Turning to the business and finance section, Volkswagen is to end its production of its only U.S. electric vehicle by Christopher Otts. Volkswagen will stop producing the ID.4 electric crossover at its Tennessee assembly plant, the latest casualty in the U.S. auto industry's retreat from EVs. Production of the crossover will stop in mid-April as the plant prepares to change its higher-volume gas SUV, the Atlas, to the 2027 model year, the German automaker said Thursday. The ID.4 is VW's lone EV built in the U.S. The EV market continues to challenge the industry, requiring measured decisions throughout the last few years to navigate this unpredictability, Volkswagen's American subsidiary said. Volkswagen said its U.S. dealers would continue to sell the ID.4 with enough vehicles in stock to last into next year. No production workers will lose jobs as a result of the change, the company said. The plant has a single assembly line for the Atlas and the ID.4, and workers in other areas specific to the EV will be reallocated to support the Atlas. The company is offering a buyout for employees over age 55 years old, a spokesman said. The plant employs about 3,000 hourly workers. VW said it was honoring a recent commitment to the UAW to explore a new vehicle for the Chattanooga plant. A future version of the ID.4 is planned for North America, but a spokesman wouldn't say when it will be introduced or where the vehicle will be assembled. VW will continue to build the ID.4 in Germany. The ID.4 made its debut in 2021 and once represented a key part of VW's electric ambitions in the U.S. At the time, the automaker was in the midst of an aggressive strategy to go all electric, including targeting as much as 55% of its U.S. sales to be battery-powered vehicles. It has since walked back that goal, extending its plans for more internal combustion models. VW sold 22,373 of the crossovers in the U.S. in 2025, up from 17,021 in 2024, according to Motor Intelligence. The ID.4, which starts at about $45,000, was the 10th best-selling EV in the U.S. in 2025, just behind the Chevrolet Blazer EV, the firm said. Looking at Heard on the Street, Financial Analysis and Commentary, the first article is Estee Lauder's turnaround faces a risk, by Carol Ryan. Having skin in the game won't always stop family founders from making bad decisions. Estee Lauder's minority investors might soon find that out the hard way. Shares of the U.S. cosmetics giant have been trending down since management said it's in talks to buy Spanish fragrance company Puig. The move blindsided shareholders and came after a profit warning, and the war in Iran had already hammered the stock this year. Estee Lauder simply has too much on its hands fixing its existing business to take on its biggest acquisition ever. The problem? The Lauder family owns around 1/3 of the stock, but controls the company through super voting shares. So family members can ram a deal through and force the bill for a misguided move onto outside investors. The company has been a poor investment for a long time, but was starting to show signs of turning a corner. Estee Lauder stock is down more than 70% over the past 5 years, and operating margins have slid from 20% in the company's financial year through June 2022 to 8% at its latest. The business suffered after becoming too reliant on China, travel retail, and U.S. department stores, all areas where growth has slowed. Rival L'Oreal is also family-controlled, but has fared better during a tough spell for beauty companies. Estee Lauder launched a makeover plan a year ago that is showing promise. The business returned to growth in the second half of 2025 after 4 consecutive quarters of shrinking sales. Investors are scratching their heads about why Estee Lauder would take on a complicated acquisition before the turnaround has really taken hold. It's the corporate equivalent of applying a full face of makeup without doing the necessary skincare prep beforehand. True, some aspects of a tie-up with Puig make sense. The Spanish company gets most of its sales from luxury fragrances, a category that has grown 13% a year on average since 2020. Data from Euromonitor shows demand for high-end fragrance is slowing but is still outperforming luxury skincare, which Estee Lauder dominates. A combined company would also have a better geographic mix. Then there's L'Oreal. A deal would help Estee Lauder and Puig compete with their larger, nimbler French rival. This is especially important given that L'Oreal is doubling down on luxury fragrances and cosmetics. Puig is probably more open to a deal than in the past because other opportunities have slipped through its fingers. Last year, L'Oreal outbid the Spanish company in a €4 billion, or roughly $4.66 billion, purchase of Kering's luxury beauty business, which includes the rights to develop makeup and perfume for Gucci. The deal with Puig is a distraction for Estee Lauder, though. The company has been slow to adapt to new sales channels such as TikTok Shop, where consumers now do more of their beauty spending. It risks losing market share to independent brands such as Rhode, founded by model and influencer Hailey Bieber, that attracted young consumers by building massive followings on social media. Estee Lauder has launched 12 brands on Amazon Premium Beauty, which is a good start, but it needs more time to fix its distribution. Additionally, the company's record with mergers and acquisitions is patchy. Estee Lauder recently took an impairment charge of $773 million on Tom Ford, the makeup company it purchased for $2.8 billion in 2023. And investor unease over the deal could make its economics worse. Since around $5 billion has been wiped off the stock recently, Estee Lauder might have to pony up more cash for Puig in any cash and share offer. That would increase the combined company's net debt to earnings before investment, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. This could prove another point of concern for investors if debt levels grow too high. One of the supposed benefits of investing in family-controlled businesses is that their brands are managed for the long term, and the thinking goes that with personal wealth on the line, family members should make better decisions than external executives. The downside is that outside shareholders have little leverage when they dislike the direction the company is taking. These stocks can quickly turn into value traps if the family starts making bad decisions. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A second article under Heard on the Street, Value and Growth Aren't Your Only Options. This has been a good year for value stocks, relatively speaking at least. An energy shock and a major sell-off in software companies over AI replacement fears will do that. Maybe value can continue to beat growth, but there are speedier steeds in the investing factor horse race. Of those two well-known styles, growth is the recent standout and the easier of the two to define. How quickly are sales and earnings growing, and does the stock have momentum? It wins in a straightaway sprint. Value is by far the long-distance champ, though. Its problem lately isn't so much being out of fashion as how it's measured. Back when America was a mostly industrial economy, acolytes of Benjamin Graham, notably Berkshire Hathaway chairman Warren Buffett, ran circles around competitors by owning stocks that were cheap on paper. Buffett surprised many when he bought seemingly pricey Coca-Cola shares in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He grasped that its brand was a wonderful asset not reflected on its balance sheet. Around that time, academics formally described the value premium, basing it on simple accounting measures. The S&P 500 Pure Value Index recently fetched a price-to-book value ratio of 1.02 times, while its corresponding Pure Growth Index multiple was a lofty 6.53. One likely reason growth trounced value in most recent years since the financial crisis is that it had the highest portfolio overlap with a factor better than either one: quality plus free cash flow. Companies like Visa, Apple, Nvidia, Johnson & Johnson, and Microsoft are able to generate a lot of excess cash, but they also make high returns on what they reinvest. Together, this has made them standouts. That combination is reflected in the S&P 500 Quality FCF Aristocrats Index, created in 2024 and reconstructed for these calculations. A hypothetical $10,000 investment in the 15 years through March would have grown into $95,080, more than twice as much as the S&P 500 Value Index and 46% more than the S&P 500 overall. Like the similarly named Dividend Aristocrats, it rewards consistency, at least 10 straight years of positive free cash flow, in addition to a high free cash flow margin and a high free cash flow return on invested capital. While the index is no household name, investors have bid up many stocks with those winning qualities. Buffett has said he regretted not selling Coca-Cola when it got expensive. He did sell a chunk of his wildly profitable Apple position. Value still works, but measuring it requires more than a pocket calculator. If these aristocrats fall out of favor, look past accounting measures and consider paying what still looks like a high sticker price for that pedigree. This was by Spencer Jacob. And the last article in Heard on the Street is the spiraling cost of making AI. Spending money to make money is taking on a whole new meaning in the artificial intelligence world. The public's already familiar with the exorbitant capital spending of the world's largest tech companies as they race to build up their AI capabilities. But the two companies that compel much of that investment have sizable bills of their own. OpenAI and Anthropic expect to spend nearly $65 billion combined this year, just on the cost to train and operate their AI models, according to financial documents obtained by the Wall Street Journal. That exceeds what the two companies are generating in revenue. And those two cost items are expected to soar to a combined $127 billion next year and reach nearly $250 billion by 2029. These are costs that the two companies themselves are projecting in financial documents they've circulated to their private investors. OpenAI expects its costs for training and inference, the latter refers to the process by which AI models respond to user queries, to exceed its revenue until 2029. Anthropic expects to cross that line next year, though other costs are expected to keep the Claude chatbot parent in the red on a pre-tax earnings basis until 2029. Reality could also play out differently. For instance, both companies could end up growing revenue at an even more explosive rate than currently projected. But costs in the AI market so far have proven to move in one direction only, up. And both OpenAI and Anthropic are competing head-to-head with some of the world's largest companies that are themselves developing their own advanced AI models. A key difference: they have lucrative core businesses that can pay for their AI ambitions. Google parent Alphabet and Facebook parent Meta platforms are expected to generate a combined $334 billion in cash from operations this year, according to consensus estimates from FactSet. Will public investors really be ready to underwrite such expensive endeavors? Both OpenAI and Anthropic are reportedly planning initial public offerings for later this year. Admittedly, signs of AI's runaway costs have been apparent for a while, given the blowout spending of major cloud network operators and the huge growth of key component suppliers like Nvidia. Also, OpenAI and Anthropic would hardly be the first major tech companies to go public while still deep in the red. Some of those that have turned out quite well for investors. Amazon.com showed annual operating losses and burned cash for 3 years after its IPO in May 1997, according to data from S&P Global Market Intelligence. But even Amazon wasn't as much of a relative stretch. The e-commerce upstart went public at a market value of around $430 million, which was less than 0.01% of the S&P 500's value at the time. By contrast, OpenAI and Anthropic are together valued at more than $1.2 trillion, based on their most recent funding rounds, according to PitchBook data. That equates to over 2% of the S&P 500's current value. The ability of the largest AI labs to control their costs will matter much more to a wider swath of investors than Amazon's willingness to sell Harry Potter books at a loss. This was by Dan Gallagher. In business and finance, green energy gets new push amid Mideast price shocks, by Ed Ballard. Will the war in the Persian Gulf spur a durable boost in green energy? For Rahul Agrawal, the answer is definitely yes. Soon after the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran, he and his colleagues were fielding calls from officials in the Philippines government. Actis, the infrastructure investor that Agrawal works for, is working on one of the country's largest energy projects, a solar and battery farm that will eventually cover nearly 14 square miles of land north of Manila and provide power for 2.4 million households. The government, sizing up an energy crisis as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz throttled Asia's fuel supplies, wanted to know how quickly the firm could build more plants, Agrawal said. The Amtara solar project, only 10% of which has been brought online, is also among a slate of green energy facilities that were fast-tracked in recent weeks. One grid connection permit that would take months in normal times arrived in days, Agrawal said. Whether or not the current uneasy ceasefire in the Middle East leads to lasting resumption of energy flows, that approval is one small mark the Iran crisis has left on the energy world. This is not theory. This is actually happening on the ground now, Agrawal said. Governments from the UK to South Korea have vowed in recent weeks to deploy more clean energy to reduce their exposure to volatile oil and gas prices. That long-term aspiration is paired with emergency measures such as increasing coal burning and fuel rationing. Energy crises are no guarantee of transformation. The 1970s Gulf oil embargo, for example, sparked a nuclear power boom, but the 2022 energy shock in Europe didn't much alter the growth trajectory of wind and solar power, despite many policy announcements. In the Philippines, which is confronting not just high fuel prices but also outright shortages, the energy security argument for going green has become an easier sell even in the few years since Russia invaded Ukraine, Agrawal said. That is because the cost of Chinese solar panels and batteries has fallen. Complex emissions challenges, like how to electrify industrial processes, aren't solved by falling solar panel prices, but they become an easier lift. Each crisis hammers the point home. Even before the price of imported liquefied natural gas soared in March, Intera Solar was expected to deliver 13 hours of power a day at a cost marginally below that of LNG. That was unthinkable until recently. In 2022, solar plus battery paired together was still more expensive than LNG-based power, Agrawal said. In the last, I would say 3 years, the decline in battery prices has been quite phenomenal. Laura Cooper has an article about the brewers saying Hispanic consumers are returning. Beer investors haven't fared well over the past year, but an overhang for one of the industry's biggest stocks is starting to lift. Shares of Constellation Brands, whose beer brands include Modelo, Corona, and Pacifico, rose more than 8% Thursday. The company is seeing signs that Hispanic consumers are buying the company's brews again. It's too early to declare victory, but the trends have been more positive said Chief Executive Bill Newlands in an interview. It's at a point where it's difficult to say why, but they may simply be more comfortable. Newlands, who leaves his post at the helm of Constellation next week, has been vocal about the effect immigration raids and affordability issues have had on the company's brands and consumers. Constellation began conducting monthly studies to poll Hispanic buyers after sales took a tumble last year. For its Corona brand, the consumer cohort makes some 30% of sales, the company has said. Constellation announced sales of its brews had increased 1% in the most recent quarter. And repurchase requests have hit Carlyle's flagship private credit fund by Isaac Taylor. Carlyle Group's flagship private credit interval fund is the latest to be hit with a wave of share redemption requests as investors' fears about a potential private credit meltdown continue. The Carlyle Tactical Private Credit Fund, or CTAC, received repurchase requests amounting to roughly 15.7% of shares outstanding, more than 3 times the 5% quarterly redemption limit that the asset manager has set, the firm revealed in a shareholder letter Thursday. The fund, which had more than $7 billion in total assets, including leverage, as of late January, has an emphasis on direct lending, which accounts for 41% of the fund's portfolio, according to its website. In its shareholder letter, Carlyle underscored the fund's diversification and relatively small individual positions as risk mitigators to the portfolio. No single credit accounts for more than roughly 1.5% of the total fund's portfolio, which is spread across nearly 1,000 investments, the letter said. The Carlyle Fund is the latest of a string of private credit business development companies and interval funds that have been hit with large redemption requests amid fears about artificial intelligence disruption in the software sector and concerns about how firms value their private credit holdings. Many of the wealthy investors that helped fuel the private credit boom over the past decade are now heading for the exits. A representative for Carlyle said the CTAC fund also was exposed to redemption requests from investors looking for liquidity after being unable to fully redeem shares from other private credit funds. The representative added that Carlyle's overall global wealth fundraising in March was up 30% compared with March of 2025. The recent private credit market dislocation prompted ratings provider Moody's Ratings to change its outlook for the business development companies sector to negative from stable to reflect the increased redemption pressures. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, April 10th issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. and Friday at 6 p.m. Your reader has been Dasha. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the Buffalo Criterion, followed at 8 o'clock by the New York Times, and at 9 o'clock by Buffalo Spree. Stay with us for these readings and more throughout the day. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes